Donald Trump's sweeping pardon of January 6th insurrectionists, including the hundreds that violently attacked police officers, all in an attempt to overthrow a free and fair election and unlawfully put Trump back in office, is so morally and politically unpopular that even Trump sycophant Lindsey Graham dares to publicly criticize it on live TV. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, I've got a clip or two to show you here. Lindsey Graham, as you know, is a Republican senator and a sycophant, somebody who claims to be a principled Republican, a principled conservative, and he opposed Donald Trump in 2016. He actually competed against him for the Republican nomination. He lost quite badly, but he viciously and correctly attacked Donald Trump during that campaign, calling him out for his stupidity and his bigotry and his authoritarian impulses. But once Trump won the nomination, Lindsey Graham, like most others, bent the knee. And this man looks for every opportunity imaginable to subordinate, to prostrate himself before Trump. And that makes what Trump did with respect to the January 6th insurrectionists all the more remarkable, because Lindsey Graham is willing, with Trump at the apex of his power, to publicly criticize the disastrous decision to pardon the insurrectionists. And he did so during a recent appearance on Meet the Press. So we're going to play this clip and unpack it together.
President Trump's decision to pardon, to give blanket pardons to everyone who was convicted of crimes on January 6th, including the 172 people who pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement officers. Even his own vice president said, quote, "If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned." Do you believe that President Trump was wrong to issue these blanket pardons to the January 6th
Number one,
defendants?
he had the legal authority to do it, but I fear that you will get more violence. Pardoning the people who went into the Capitol and beat up a police officer violently, I think was a mistake, because it seems to suggest that's an okay thing to do. Kamala Harris wanted to raise bail money for people burning down Minneapolis. You know, Biden pardoned half his family going out the door. I think most Americans, if this continues, to see this as an abuse of the pardon power, that we'll revisit the pardon power of the president if this continues. But as to pardoning violent people who beat up cops, I think that's a mistake.
So you think it was a mistake by President Trump to issue these blanket pardons? What message does it convey to law enforcement? And if you conveyed that directly to Mr. Trump?
There's really been no better supporter of law enforcement in general. And there are a lot of people who supported President Trump and law enforcement didn't like this. But he said it during the campaign. He's not tricking people. You know, Biden promised not to pardon his family. He did. Trump said, "I'm going to pardon these people." So the fact that he did it is no surprise. But I'll be consistent here. I don't like the idea of bailing people out of jail or pardoning people who burn down cities and beat up cops, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat.
Okay.
So we're not going to give Lindsey Graham plaudits here. Again, this is not a real act of courage. It just goes to show how incredibly unpopular this decision is, and we'll provide recent polling to this point. But let's deal with the typical Republican tactic, which we've seen from elected Republicans since Trump made his pardons. Even the few who dared to criticize it, like Tom Tillis, for example, Republican senator from North Carolina, felt the need to couch it in, well, what about what Joe Biden did? And Lindsey Graham did that here, and also mentioned Vice President Kamala Harris, then Senator Kamala Harris, posting the link to a bail fund in Minnesota. So, let's deal with the false equivalence. Number one, none of President Biden's family members were investigated, charged, or convicted of violently attacking the police. There is no evidence whatsoever that at any point they violently attacked the police. So if they had violently attacked the police and President Biden pardoned them, then you would have an apples-to-apples comparison, Lindsey. But because that didn't happen, there's no moral equivalence here. The people who violently attacked the police on January 6, 2021, in an attempt to overthrow a free and fair election and keep Donald Trump in power unlawfully, they are objectively, morally inferior to what you think may have happened with regards to the Biden family. It's just true. We don't have an apples-to-apples comparison here. What we know about the January 6th defendants is objectively far worse than what you may believe but can't prove about President Biden's family. So, number one, What Trump did is just objectively far worse, number one. Number two, Kamala Harris. So during the George Floyd protests, the biggest mass social protest in the history of this country, period. I think actually in the history of the world. We're talking about, I think estimates had it anywhere from 15 to 25 million people, and protests that occurred in all 50 states over the span of like a year and a half. That is a staggering level of scale. During that time, protesters were arrested. Yes, violent rioters were arrested, but sometimes peaceful protesters were arrested as well. Bail exists in this country. Defendants, violent or peaceful, are entitled to some sort of defense. And the tweet that Vice President Harris made, then Senator Harris made, was for a Minnesota indigent bail fund, people who were entitled to bail legally, but could not afford to post it. And it was not targeted towards violent George Floyd protesters. It was not a bail fund specifically set up for violent protesters. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to your face. It was a general indigent bail fund, period. And she just retweeted it. So what they want you to believe is, okay, Kamala Harris retweeting a general bail fund for people who are legally entitled to bail, some of whom may have been arrested for the George Floyd protest, and some of them may have committed violence, that all of this like 7-degree chain of causality is as bad as Donald Trump deliberately, purposefully pardoning violent cop beaters. That is a stupid comparison. It's a dishonest comparison. And even if you're entitled, or rather, even if you're predisposed to not giving Vice President Harris the benefit of the doubt and just assuming she actually wanted violent protesters at the George Floyd protest to be released on bail, even if you believe that, that is nowhere near as bad as Donald Trump purposefully pardoning people who were convicted or pled guilty to attacking the police. You would have a point if President Biden pardoned people who had been federally convicted during the George Floyd protests of attacking the cops. That would be, again, another apples to apples comparison. But that's not what happened. So no matter how you slice it, it's simply a fact. What Donald Trump did was objectively far worse. And Lindsey Graham knows that. But he feels the need to couch his criticism, his public criticism of Trump, in some criticisms of President Biden and Vice President Harris in order to soften the blow. But anyone who spends more than 20 seconds thinking about it will come to the conclusion what Donald Trump did, even if we grant you all your premises, is just objectively worse. He's always worse because he is morally inferior to every elected Democrat. Now, the polling on this is pretty brutal. So Reuters conducted a poll Monday and Tuesday after Donald Trump's inauguration. Trump starts new term with 47% approval. So again, he has not achieved majority approval. It's higher now than it's ever been, which is sad, but he is not, approved by a majority of the country. January 6 pardons remain unpopular. So the poll also showed that Americans were already sour on some of Donald Trump's first moves. Some 58% of respondents said that Trump should not pardon all people convicted of crimes during the January 6th assault on the Capitol. This is true. Please indicate how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. Donald Trump should pardon all protesters who were convicted of crimes committed on January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol. Strongly agree, 11%. Okay, that's 24% of Republicans, so 1/4 strongly agree that Donald Trump should pardon all protesters. So still a substantial minority, but also a quarter, right? Not insignificant. Only 11% of independents, the 1 in 10 independents strongly support it. 1 in 4 Republicans strongly support it. Somewhat agree. Well, then it goes to 13%. And again, another quarter of Republicans, so 1 in 4 strongly or somewhat agree that Trump should have pardoned them all. But again, only 11% of independents. So you're getting, in terms of total approval, 2 in 10 out of independents. 2 in 4 Republicans support it. Somewhat disagree. 16% of Republicans somewhat disagree. 13% of independents somewhat disagree. But this is where you start to see the bombshell. 46% strongly disagree, including 48% of independents. So nearly half of independents not only disagree, but strongly disagree with pardoning all January 6th convicted criminals. And the net is 58 to 24. So net agree, 24. Only 1/4 of Americans agree, strongly or somewhat, with the pardons, which I think is quite frankly too high. 60%, or approximately 60%, disagree. So this is extremely unpopular. Now the question is, okay, it's objectively unpopular. We've seen it in the polling. This is nothing new. Will it be relevant? I don't think so. And here's why. Because Donald Trump did it on his first day. The media ecosystem is very biased towards Trump. It favors Trump, okay? You have an enormously well-funded, sophisticated media apparatus that will either defend this decision or ignore it, okay? They're either going to do their best to minimize its unpopularity or they're just going to move past it, okay? That benefits Trump. The rest of the mainstream media, including CNN, they'll criticize the decision, but they're also going to go out of their way, as they always do, to grade Trump on a curve so as not to be seen as liberally biased. The only mainstream network that will persistently criticize this decision is MSNBC, and they're smaller than CNN, and both of them combined are a fraction of Fox News, which is the biggest player in mainstream media. Alternate media, so on YouTube, like I am, again, this decision will either be defended by the likes of Tim Pool, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, and others, or it will be ignored by them. So that media ecosystem, again, favors Trump. And this was done on his first day. The next election will be the midterms in 2026. There's no way that outrage about the January 6 pardons will carry through to the midterms. And certainly not without a persistent, persuasive effort by elected Democrats and media, be it me, Brian Tyler Cohen, Luke Beasley, David Pakman, all of us in concert, elevating how dangerous and lawless this is for the reasons that Lindsey Graham described. This sends a signal to violent protesters, to violent rioters, to violent insurrectionists, whatever their political persuasion, that this is acceptable and that you may receive some sort of presidential pardon at the end of it. So if you engage in political violence at the behest of Donald Trump or in Donald Trump's interests, it may all be wiped off the table. Even Lindsey Graham admits that that's the signal this is sending. So unless we articulate the moral outrage consistently, persuasively, and do our part, there's no way this carries until the midterms. A thing can be extremely unpopular and not decisive at the same time. Everything about January 6th has always been unpopular. Let's be very clear about this. Any Republican or enlightened centrist who tells you, oh, people support January 6th is bullshit. It's always polled terribly for Republicans and Trump. That's why it was in Trump's best interest in terms of persuading people to avoid January 6th as much as possible. However, in this last election, what we learned is that even though people are not happy about January 6th, even though they do blame Donald Trump for January 6th, even though they don't want Donald Trump to do what he just did on his first day in office, it's not a high priority for them. So that's why I just want to be very clear. On its merits, it's worth talking about. But I am not confident that this will accrue a political consequence by the time of the next election. Now, what it might do is potentially put Republicans in blue states like Susan Collins or Tom Tillis in purple states, again, North Carolina. It might make them politically vulnerable because they don't have Trump's invincibility when it comes to these sorts of things. In theory, blue and purple state Democrats could loudly, persistently, persuasively make the case in a way which could hurt Trump's Republican allies in those states. But I think that's the best case scenario. So, again, incredibly dangerous, incredibly unpopular, such that even Lindsey Graham found his spine for a moment, and I think that's worth talking about. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.